Hello, players and parents. This is Michael here from Beyond Pulse. I hope you're all doing really well. I've just got a really short video here that's going to give a brief explanation as to the session summary email report that you receive immediately after you use the belts, whether it's for a team session and your coach is syncing the data and the belts with their app, or whether you use your own individual player app to record your session. And so this is just an example of actually a session that I recently did with the belts. It was actually a run that I was on. So at the top, very simple, you'll see your name and how long you trained for. And then from the beginning, the first metric that we show is heart rate. So specifically what we're looking at here is how many minutes did you spend working in what's called your red zone, which is essentially time above 80% of your maximum heart rate. So you can see here that for me, I spent 34 minutes working in my red zone, which is considered high. Anything above 30 minutes is considered pretty high, which means generally you had a pretty solid workout. So again, the idea here being that the more time you spend in this zone, the higher the intensity of the practice or the training that you were doing. If you look to the left here, though, we've got some more numbers. So, it will show you what was your maximum heart rate. So I hit 189 beats per minute, but I think my true maximum is closer to 200 beats per minute. So I wasn't quite there, but not far off. What was my average beats per minute for the time that I worked out? And then, how many minutes did I spend working across all of the heart rate zones? Because we track every second that your heart beats, and we then have it categorized into these zones. So if I'm resting, if I'm walking, I'm not really doing much, you'd expect to see more time in these zones versus, the more physical activity, more vigorous activity that you're doing, the more time you're probably going to spend in these zones here. And you'll notice that we just add together, here's 80%, 80 to 90 and 90 plus. We add those two things together, and that's what gives you your 34 minutes here in the red zone. Moving on to distance, this one's pretty straightforward, total distance covered. We then have the conversion from meters into miles, which we know is important for some folks. And then we also show your distance per minute. And then we break down, similar to the heart rate, we break down your distance into speed zones. So low speed, which is generally sort of walking, medium speed, which is more jogging, high speed, which is more a run, and maximum speed, which is more sprinting. So for me, I did a run. I went for a run in the park, and, most of it was obviously spent jogging and a more faster jog. I wasn't really doing much sprinting, and I didn't really do any walking. Obviously, in soccer, you'd expect to see a more even spread of this data because there is quite a bit of walking, and you're obviously doing quite a bit more sprinting versus just going for a run. So this is an example of what you might see here in distance. And then the final two metrics, we show our workload. Really simple. This is just a number that gives a measurement of how hard you worked. The higher this number, the harder the workout, the more workload that you generated. So obviously, if I just went for a walk for an hour, my workload is probably going to be pretty low because I was just walking. It's not really too taxing. I can do that forever. But because I went on quite a long run, and I did it at a fairly decent pace, my workload is pretty high because I ran for nearly 1 hour. And then obviously, if you're doing a lot of sprints, that can be a reason why your workload is high. I didn't do so many because I was going just for a run. I wasn't doing any sprints. So again, workload is an interesting one. The higher the number, key takeaway, the higher the number, the higher the load, the lower the number, the lower the load. And then active participation. This is a really fun one for practices in particular when you're training with your team, because this one shows, okay, well, throughout the course of our 1 hour and a half, 2 hours perhaps that you train, how much of that session were you physically active for? So we know that on average in the US, it's anything between sort of 50 and 60% active participation. And again, you'll be able to see for yourselves what your team training active participation looks like. And we just translate that also into active minutes. So again, in a 90-minute practice, how much time did I move versus inactive minutes? How much time did I stand still? And so for me, as I told you already several times, I went for a run, which meant I was pretty active the entire time. I didn't really stop that much other than in the beginning. I took a minute or two to just stretch and get my stuff ready, get my music on. And then I took a minute or two at the end as I rested and stretched when I finished my run. But obviously, for most of the time, I was active, I was moving. And so this is a way in which you can then start to see for yourselves your activity levels when you train and when you play. So again, this was just a brief explanation as to some of the data that you start to see in your session summary report immediately after you finish working out with the belts. And you should see this in your inbox right away.